Thank you everybody for joining us today. My name is Glenn Barnes, Senior Project Director at the Environmental Finance Center here at UNC, and I am the co-director of our Smart Management for Small Communities, Small Water Systems project. And I'd just like to welcome you all today to our webinar on board and staff communication. With this project, we work nationally with small drinking water systems on all areas of finance and management, including rate setting, fiscal planning, asset management, water loss detection, energy management. And today's subject, I think, really cuts across many of the areas that we work on because we need to be able to convince decision makers and our customers that we need rate increases or changes in how we manage the system in order to run fully efficient water systems. And so I'm very excited to share with you some of the information that we have today based in part on a national survey of local government water systems that we conducted last year. Today's webinar is part of our educational series under this grant from EPA. We have one more webinar for the calendar year, which will actually be on Thursday. It's an Ask the Expert series on asset management. So if you have not signed up for that already, I highly encourage you to do so. If you're calling in from Wisconsin, we'll also be doing a demonstration tomorrow afternoon of our rates dashboard for the state of Wisconsin. And again, you can go to efcnetwork.org and learn more about those upcoming trainings. We've done most of our in-person sessions for the calendar year. We have a couple of states left, but we will be starting our next round of funding in January, and we'll again be returning to your states to provide in-person workshops and an additional series of webinars. So please be on the lookout for that information. And we are also have one-on-one assistance available for you who come from small water systems serving 10,000 or fewer people, and I'll give you a little bit more information about that at the end. Our objectives for today really are two things. One is that I want to talk a little bit about strategies for getting buy-in for needed rate increases. And really, the communication strategies that we're going to talk about today are relevant to any type of board and staff communication. But in particular, I think we're going to focus in on the need for rate increases as kind of the crux of our discussion. And then, as I mentioned earlier, we're going to learn a little bit about a recent nationwide survey that we did of current practices around the country. But before we do that, I would like to get to know everybody who's on the line today a little bit better. So we have a couple of polling questions for you. First one that Laura will pull up for us is what kind of drinking water utility do you represent? Are you from a for-profit system? Are you from a local government? Are you from a sanitary district? Are you from other type of district? Or are you not from a water system? So please select the appropriate answer on the screen, and we'll see the results in just a second. All right, thank you very much. Looks like we have mostly people here from local government systems and quite a number who are not from systems as well, so we're glad to have all of you here today. Okay, we're going to do a second polling question here, just looking at system size. So what size water system does your utility operate by number of people served? Not connections, but people served. So are you very small, which is 500 or fewer? Are you in the small category, 501 to 3,300? The medium category, 3,301 to 10,000? Are you large, above 10,000? Or again, if you're not a water utility, there's an option for you there as well. All right, and it looks like we've got a good mix of system sizes here, from the very small to the very large and then some. And I think the strategies we'll talk about today are relevant across the board. All right, one last question for you. Since this is about board and staff communications, we were curious, are you a board member or are you a staff member? So if you're a board member, please select the top option, staff member the middle. And again, if you're not from a water system, go ahead and mark the bottom one for us, please. All right, thank you very much. Looks like we have mostly staff members here, but some board members as well. And so we appreciate all of you being able to join us today. So Laura, thanks for doing the polling, and we're going to go on now with the presentation. So really, when it comes down to board and staff communication and around the question of needed rate increases, I really think we need to start with the question of how much money do you need? How much do we need to fully run and operate our water systems? And I think this is an important question that we see in the work that we're doing around the country right now. And you know, in the years that I've spent working with drinking water systems, there's always a lot of pressure to see low rates. You know, we do some statewide surveys in a few states of water rates. This was a press release that was put out a few years ago after one of those surveys. And you know, the quote here, which I'll read for you, which is the opening line of the press release, is, "Once again, the city's water department proved to have some of the lowest water and sewage rates in the state." Systems love to brag about having low rates, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with having low rates if you're able to cover your cost of service fully. And so that's just not necessarily what the tone of this press release was getting at. So this is what we often see from the system side. And then, of course, from the customer side, we also wonder, what is the customer reaction to rates? So we were able to find this pretty interesting article a few years ago. I'll read the headline for you. "Residents incredibly happy about water service." Quote, "I don't know how these folks do it. Clean water whenever I need it for only a few dollars a day." Actually, that's not the headline. We doctored that one up. Sorry about that, folks. It's actually this. "Alabama residents furious over possible rate increases." Quote, "If they let this stuff happen, they are going to see the biggest riot the South has ever seen." So clearly, this is a passionate issue for people. And we realize that when we talk about increasing rates, sometimes it is not something that systems really want to be doing. But oftentimes, they maybe need to be doing it. And I think, you know, rather than perhaps asking about, are our rates as low as they can be, really the better question may be whether or not our rates will provide sufficient cost recovery. And so what does this mean exactly? I mean, there are several elements of this that we feel like are very important to look at. One is, are we following the applicable laws in our particular state as we set rates? I mean, that's an obvious one that needs to be there from the very beginning. But beyond that, you know, we wonder, are we allocating the cost to the right customers? You know, is our rate structure set up in such a way that the right customers are paying for their amount of usage? And, you know, just an example I have of this, we did a workshop a few years ago under this grant in Ohio with mobile home parks and the water systems that they operate. And many of the mobile home parks there just included water in the cost of the rent, or maybe had a $20 a month flat charge. And this one water system said that they had that, and that most of their customers used water for domestic purposes, for cooking and cleaning, laundry, showering, that type of thing. But that there was one of the gentlemen in their community who would get up every morning, he would water the grass in front of his mobile home, he would water his flowers, he would wash the mobile home from top to bottom, and he was paying $20 a month just like everybody else. So that would be an example of not really allocating the cost to the right customer, but we need to think about that as we think about how we set our rates. We want rates that customers will understand, especially if we're trying to send some type of pricing signal through those rates. We want to be concerned about whether customers will be able to pay the rates and affordability. And again, I think all of us who have worked in this field know that there's a difference between people who have a legitimate ability to pay problem, who are struggling to meet their basic needs and really need some assistance, versus people who have a willingness to pay problem, people who might be very happy to pay their cable bill or cell phone bill first and let their water bill go. But for those customers with the legitimate ability to pay problems, we need to be mindful of those as we think about providing sufficient cost recovery. You know, we want to make sure we're sending the right signals to customers. You know, if we are a growing community in a dry part of the country, like say the Southwest, we may want to have a very different rate structure from a community in say the middle part of the country. Appalachia area, for example, that may have a lot of water resources and a flat or possibly shrinking population, where really would like to be selling a lot of water and finding ways to find more water customers for our utility. So are we sending the right signals to customers? And then finally, something we've thought more and more about over the past couple of years, will our revenues be resilient to changing water demands? So generally speaking, people are using less water on a whole, and certainly we see that in areas where there's drought. Where I live here in North Carolina, we've had a few severe droughts in the last 10 years. Certainly you're all aware of the situation going on in California these days. So we want to make sure that we have a rate structure set up and a revenue structure set up that's going to deal with those changes in water demands. And so really what we're getting at here is a phrase that many of you may be familiar with, which is full cost pricing. You know, we're really looking at trying to come up with a pricing strategy that will cover our O&M expenses, but also taxes and accounting costs, contingencies for emergencies, principal and interest on long-term debt, capital reserves, and if you have source water, protecting that source water as well. So all of these are very important parts of full cost pricing and of making sure that, you know, the rates that we have are covering that full cost of operations. And so there are, especially for those of you who are from local government systems, or for those of you who have a governing board responsible for setting the rates, there is a difference in the responsibilities and roles between the board and the staff. And this is a screenshot from an e-learning module that we've developed here in North Carolina. Will be available soon on our website. And I really encourage you, when it comes out, we'll let you know, and to check it out. And I think it really goes through a lot of the differences of what is a board responsibility, what is a staff responsibility, and what is a shared responsibility. But when it comes to rate setting, oftentimes the staff are going to be in the position of determining what that rate structure should be, determining what level, a dollar amount it needs to be to recover the cost of operations, and looking at the costs and expenditures. But they're going to need to present that to some type of governing board, and that board is going to need to approve it. And so that's where we're specifically focused today, is on that communication, and how do staff members get the information to board members that board members need to make informed decisions, and how can board members better help staff members understand what that information is. Now, for those of you who are from non-governmental utilities, or depending on the state in which you reside, you may also have to go through a state public utility commission or public service commission as well. And certainly a lot of the strategies we're going to talk about today will be incorporated into that idea of a rate case going forward. Because I think what we don't want to end up happening is that you, as a staff member, ask the board, can we get a rate increase, and your board suddenly turns into Grumpy Cat and is just saying no in response to you straight away. So we want to get beyond this. We want to talk about what are the good strategies out there to really be able to communicate effectively about necessary rate changes. So what I'd like to do is to focus a little bit on some ways of getting buy-in from your boards for needed rate changes. So we're gonna talk about a couple of these strategies that, broadly speaking, that we've seen out there through the years. And the first one that I'd like to talk about is something that I think we in the water business don't do a particularly good job of always, which is appealing based on what's good. As you know, drinking water is an important public health advance. It cannot be really overstated how important it was in terms of the reduction of waterborne illnesses, diseases, infant mortality rates in the United States when we began to treat drinking water, in the early 1900s. And it's really an incredible story that I think not a lot of people have to really think about in this country anymore. You know, certainly if you have a friend or family member who's traveling abroad, especially to, maybe an adventure destination, or they might be going somewhere as, part of a mission trip or something like that, you've maybe not quite heard of the country before. Usually the first piece of advice we give to people is, don't drink the water. And that used to be really good advice here in the United States as well. There was a time in the US where the quality of the drinking water was not very good. And it's really been thanks to the efforts of water systems and their staff over time, and then certainly the regulatory environment that we're in, that we can now claim to have really safe water. But, you know, one of the key things that we think about is for finance and management, in particular around the area of asset management, is what is the level of service that we want to provide to our customers? You know, all of us obviously are shooting for the minimal level of service, which is meeting the EPA's Safe Drinking Water Act requirements. But beyond that, you know, there are things that our customers care a great deal about when it comes to water. They care about how does that water taste? How does it smell? What does it look like? What color is it? Is it, you know, staining people's white clothing in the washing machine as they're trying to do laundry? And, you know, what kind of pressure are they getting coming out of their shower head in the morning when they're trying to get ready for work or get the kids off to school? So, you know, our customers, they're customers, and they care a good deal about the quality of the water. And I think sometimes that we have a tendency to only be reaching out to systems and to customers, and interacting with them when something is not going right with the system. Certainly, if we've had any kind of a reporting violation or other Safe Drinking Water Act violation that we need to notify customers about, we do that. Systems are sending out their annual, you know, lab results and things like that that some customers don't always understand. But what I have up on the screen here, this is from not a small water system, but actually the metropolitan system that serves the greater Boston area. And this is an article from the Boston Globe, so the paper of record in Boston, a fairly large newspaper there. You know, water has MWRA bubbling with joy, and the quote that I pulled out of there from their water operator is, you know, it's clean and it's crisp and it's refreshing and it's a great product. You know, so that was from the executive director of the Massachusetts Water Resources Authority. And it's a way to kind of remind our customers that, you know, we have a good product that's out there. And certainly as we've gone out and done a lot of workshops around the country, the issue comes up of, well, you know, people don't want to pay for water. It's like, well, I mean, they'll pay a lot for the stuff that comes in a bottle. They'll pay an awful lot for the stuff that comes in a bottle compared to what we have. And, you know, we don't have Madison Avenue marketers behind us, and nor should we probably. But I think we could take advantage of appealing based on what's really good, and that's something we could do a little bit better job of. But of course, we know it's unfortunately not all sunshine and flowers when it comes to our water systems, that oftentimes we have things that are not going so well. And one of the most important things that we often see is the state of the infrastructure here in the United States. And if you're familiar with the report, I have the screenshot up for you now from the American Society of Civil Engineers. Every couple of years, they come out with a national report card and then a state-by-state report card of our infrastructure, including water and wastewater. The latest report that came out 2 years ago, our overall GPA for our infrastructure was a D+. Water and wastewater both received Ds. And, you know, while it's true that you don't hear about a lot of people dying from waterborne diseases, thank goodness, in this country, you know, I think because of the hard work of people like yourselves of running your systems as well as you can, we all know that we're stretching the infrastructure as far as it can go, I mean, literally to the breaking point in many cases, and that, you know, eventually it's going to catch up with us, and that we're going to need to be thinking about having more of an investment in our infrastructure over time. So this may be another way to appeal to decision makers and to customers, you know, not just at what we're doing well, but what the risks are to us of continuing and not fixing our infrastructure over time. My colleague Shadi Eskaf did a really good blog post a few weeks back, and we'll give you an opportunity, if you're not already signed up for our blog, to do so at the end of the webinar today. But he found an OMB report from this past year that looked at spending on water systems across the country, federal, state, and local spending going all the way back to the 1950s. And one of the amazing things that was in that report was that when you adjust the dollars for inflation, so they're in constant 2014 dollars, the amount of money that we spend on infrastructure for the past 60 years has been relatively flat, while the amount of money that we spend on O&M has been increasing fairly steadily. And I think the reason for that is most likely that when we have limited financial resources, we obviously have to spend money on O&M first and then on infrastructure, and really that infrastructure number should be higher than it is currently. And so this is another way that we can make that appeal as to why we need changes in the rates and why we need to move forward with funding increases. So I would say in addition to kind of warning about what's wrong and doing it in a, you know, in a kind of objective way of looking at something like the American Society of Civil Engineers report, although of course being the American Society of Civil Engineers, one would imagine they would be the ones you would hire to fix the failing infrastructure. Some might say that gives them an incentive to make the report card look a little bit worse than maybe it is. But in seriousness, I don't think they're too far off. But kind of a related strategy, which you could say, is to basically try to scare the heck out of people and warn of consequences. You know, when does a crack become a crisis? And, you know, thinking of the story from when we're kids of, you know, the Dutch boy with his finger in the dam, you know, holding back the water. So, you know, there are consequences to what happens with when our infrastructure fails. And I think this is an important strategy because we've often seen with water systems that we work with that they will go before decision makers and present a very factual case. This is the value of the system. This is how much money we need. You know, this is what we need to be fixed. But they don't really take the extra step of talking about the impacts on humans. And that's not necessarily just a health impact. I mean, obviously, we have regulatory responsibility, and we want to be able to keep people safe. But that's not the only way that a failure in our water system impacts people, as all of you well know. Having to shut off water for one or multiple customers while lines are repaired can create a great inconvenience for them if they're trying to get ready in the morning to get to work or get to school. You know, can impact businesses that rely on water, such as restaurants or car washes, laundromats, etc. Places where, you know, having access to water is a lifeline to the business itself. And there's, you know, other social consequences of just, you know, closing down a main street at a time when people are trying to get their kids to school in the morning, and having lanes closed and having traffic backed up, having to deal with cracks in the pipes and things like that. And then obviously, as infrastructure fails, we run the risk of potentially contaminating the drinking water that has already been treated. So that's also something that we need to be very cognizant of in terms of the consequences. Now, I hope none of you ever have the situation that we see on the screen right now of a giant sinkhole opening up because of a water main break, but I'm sure for those of you who have been in the business for a long time, something like this has happened to some level. And I don't want to sit here and ever suggest that we want to look forward to something going wrong, but I will say that when something does go wrong, it is an opportunity for us to talk about why it went wrong and to really remind people of the potential dangers of you know, of what's going on in our system. You know, there's a story that we tell about a community that we've worked with in the past that they had tried to get a rate increase passed, weren't successful when they went before the board, and they started getting a lot of water leaks in the system. Probably based on the size of the system, they would leak on almost a daily basis, and the paper of record in their area, for whatever reason, started to cover them, and that became an impetus for the elected officials to take action because all of a sudden it was more visible that there was something going wrong with the water system. And so, you know, we want to be able to take advantage of, you know, if something were to go wrong, to take time to explain why that happened and why it's important. You know, certainly it said that a picture is worth 1,000 words, and one of the things that we have at our disadvantage with water systems is that our infrastructure is buried under the ground, and it doesn't have the same kind of, you know, visibility as, say, a pothole in a street would have, or, you know, a light being out, a stoplight being out, or a traffic light being out. So whenever possible, if you have an opportunity to show visual images of the state of some of the infrastructure that may be in disrepair, that could be to your decision makers, to your customers, or to funding agencies for that matter. I think that's always very powerful, and it's something that we may want to take advantage of a little bit more often. And then certainly a lot of us who are in the water business are numbers people. And this is from not a small system, but a system serving about 200,000 people that we've worked with. They had a total value of their water system of $315 million. They estimated that their annual capital improvement budget over the past several years had been about $226,000. And so if you do a little bit of quick mental math there, they would repay the system total value in 1,396 years. Obviously, the system is not going to last that long. So, sometimes talking numbers can be a really effective way of communicating the need for the rate increases and the additional revenues that we have. And if all else fails, I suppose we can always hope for divine intervention. All right, now this is an Onion article. For those of you who don't know, the Onion is a satirical newspaper, but they ran a whole series of articles a few weeks ago when Pope Francis visited the U.S., and one of the ones that they ran was that he was laying his hands on ailing U.S. infrastructure, talking about how his heart melted when he watched these poor bridges and roads in such bad condition and everything. So, I don't think we want to get to the point of divine intervention when it comes to funding our infrastructure. So that is kind of an overview of many of the strategies that we've seen across the board. But what I'd like to do now in our remaining time is to drill down a little bit more into the question of how is this happening at water systems today? What is working well and what is not? And so our Environmental Finance Center here in North Carolina partnered with the Water Research Foundation and ICMA, the International City County Managers Association, last year, and we did a survey based on water system rate communication. We were really curious of understanding how it is that boards and staff are communicating around the question of needed changes in revenue to pay for infrastructure. And so we targeted two specific groups. Now, some of you on the line are not from governmental systems, and this was a survey specifically of governments, but I think the results will be very valuable for you as well with your decision makers. We surveyed two separate groups. One were chief administrative officers, so that would be a town manager or clerk or town administrator, whoever within the unit of government is the highest staff level person. We surveyed that level, and then we also surveyed chief elected officials, so either a mayor or the head of a board of aldermen or the head of a county commissioner group. We sent out surveys to almost 6,000 communities. More than 2,000 of the chief administrative officers responded, and about 1,400 of those came from communities that manage and set rates for their water system. And then we had about 330 mayors and other chief elected officials from those same types of communities that manage and set rates for the water systems responded. And from that population of systems, 202 of them were overlapping. So we had both the chief administrative officer and the chief elected officer from the community. I'll give you the preview right now that some of you might be wondering about. Did the chief administrative officer and chief elected official agree on their responses in the survey? And I think you can probably guess that the answer is no, they did not in many cases, which was very, very interesting for us to see. So let me walk you through a little bit about what we were trying to get at with this particular survey. I think the first thing is that we wanted to identify the most important factors and information shared regarding the most recent rate increase request. So we were really surveying, saying, all right, the last time that you had made a request of the governing board for a rate increase, what were the factors around that being approved or not approved, and what was some of the information that was shared? And that was really a way for us to start to identify the most effective methods of communicating the need for the rate increase in the first place. So we wanted to look at what is there in practice and what seems to be working. And what we found was very interesting. You know, across the board, the question was, are rates getting approved? And 90% of the respondents said yes. When they went to their governing body, the governing board, or when the staff came to the governing board, if it was the mayor or top elected official who was answering, 90% of them said, yes, we approve the rate increase. And this is a really almost surprising number in some ways. You know, maybe there's a little bit of self-selection with a group like this, that they would be more likely to respond to the survey if they had approved a rate increase. But generally speaking, you know, this was a number that really stood out to us, that 90% of people got a rate increase approved. Now, of course, the follow-up question to that, though, is what was approved versus what was requested? And, you know, we found here that somewhat surprisingly, 91% of the people essentially got what they asked for. You know, 90% of our respondents said they got between 90 and 100% of the rate increase that they requested. 1% said that they got more than what they had requested, that the elected body had actually increased the what they had asked for by a little bit. And then we saw, you know, a few others in the 40 to 50, 60 to 70, 70 to 80 range. And then at the bottom, we have the ones that didn't get anything approved. So by and large, most systems are getting rates approved, and they are getting what they asked for. And this particular slide here, we cut down to just be when a single request was made. In a few cases, we found communities would make multiple requests of their board. So this is looking at the 800 community water systems where one request was made. Again, 90+% of those systems got what they asked for, more or less, which is really terrific. But that begs the question, did they ask for enough money? You know, because what we really wondered was, what is the level at which they're asking? You know, they're asking. Are they asking for full cost pricing? Are they asking for enough to cover their operations? You know, what is the level at which they're asking? And so what we found was, you know, we asked, in your professional opinion, which statement best describes the water rate increase that was proposed to the local government governing body for approval? You know, 2% said that it was beyond what is needed in the coming year to help avoid another rate increase in a few years. 52% responded that it provided revenues to maintain a strong fiscal condition and meet most capital needs. So that's essentially full cost pricing. But take a look at these bottom two right here. So one question here was that it was significant enough, sufficient enough to address basic utility obligations, but not most capital needs. And we found that was 37% of the respondents had asked for a rate increase that would not cover the cost of capital, but only the cost of O&M. And then 8% of people said that they asked for a rate increase, but it wasn't even enough to cover their O&M costs, let alone the cost of capital. So right here, I mean, we're seeing about 45% of these systems that got their rate increase didn't really ask for enough money to cover the full cost of operations, including capital needs. So that was a really interesting finding that we had, and this was a you know, a question that we were really glad that we included in, because it gave us some insight into what's actually going on around the country with these water systems. So then again, as I said, we wanted to dig into this question of, well, how do we build the relationship between the staff and the board to be able to make sure that that rate increase gets approved? And so a couple of the things that we saw that played out really prominently. One was around the area of trust, or the working relationship between the staff and the board. Second is in the information that is conveyed, and the third is in public involvement. So on the trust side, you know, according to administrative officers, the working relationship was not really related to the size of the governing board or whether or not the rating adjustment was approved by the governing body. That was not really a key factor. But what we heard consistently from staff is that the ones that had felt that they had a better working relationship with the governing board were more likely to request higher rate increases and more likely to request full cost recovery rate increases. So what it really got down to is that those administrative officers that felt like they had this trust, they were in the 55% that were asking for that full cost recovery. And some of the ones that didn't enjoy this, I think, were more likely to be asking for the rate increase that did not meet the full cost of providing service. Now, from the elected official side, what they said is that more frequent communication and more effective communication are directly related to a good working relationship. That was one of the real keys. And let's start with this idea of more frequent communication, because we asked the people who participated in the survey, we asked them, how often does the full governing body meet with the staff to talk about the water system? You know, as you can see from the results here, 21% said every 1 to 2 months, 12% said every 3 months, 15% were in the 4 to 6 month category. But it's the last two numbers here at the bottom that I think are very telling. 45% of the communities that responded said that the full governing body meets with the staff to talk about the water system about once a year, and 6% said not every year. So again, just going back to this idea of more frequent communication is something that elected officials showed and tied into as being really key to building up trust. In practice, we don't necessarily see that happening in many communities around the country. So that's a recommendation that I think we would have, is looking at increasing that level of communication between the staff and the board, the frequency of it. But then, as I mentioned earlier, in addition to trust and kind of tied in with more effective communication, is what is the information that needs to be conveyed to governing boards? So in addition to the large national survey that we did, we also did some more in-depth interviews with water systems, which you'll see the results of up on the screen right here. And, you know, we tried to identify the factors that what is the information that they're conveying to governing boards, and how important do they think it is, and how many of the systems that we interviewed are doing this. And as you can see here, you know, how much the average bill would change was something that everybody identified, and that was rated as one of the most important pieces of information to convey to the governing board. Not surprisingly, so it's not just saying, oh, we need a, you know, 50-cent per, you know, 1,000-gallon increase or whatever the case is, but what would that impact be on your average customer, residential or otherwise in our community? All right, second is how changing circumstances are affecting finances. So, you know, are we seeing, you know, from the recession or the impacts of the economy or the job market in the area, how are those changing circumstances affecting the finances of both our customers and the water system itself? Third was the anticipated capital expenses. This is something that everybody was communicating. Fourth is the financial condition of the water utility. This is something that almost everybody we interviewed was communicating. And I'll mention we did a webinar earlier this year on key financial indicators, and we have a good spreadsheet tool for that. So if you're not really sure how to track the financial condition of the water utility, let us know, and we'll show you how to do that. We also have a great little whiteboard video that we can share with you as well on that. Interestingly, the physical condition of the water utility was something that was not as often talked about as the financial condition with the governing board. So again, that whole idea of, you know, do you have images of what the infrastructure looks like, and out of sight, out of mind issues. So this was something that was not often talked about. We asked about whether they would communicate how a proposed rate increase would compare to customer income, so affordability measures, either to median household income or to income buckets. Surprisingly, not very many systems identified this at the staff level as something they communicate. The issue of bond covenants came up in many of the communities. So if you have a bond covenant, what are the requirements of that? Only a handful of the staff level people presented multiple rate scenarios to their governing boards. Even fewer talked about the projected impact of the rate adjustments on the demand. So as typically as rates go up, the demand for water will go down a little bit, and so we expect to sell a little bit less water. A number of, probably about not quite half of the systems said that the previous history of water rate adjustments was communicated. But more so, they talked about the need for more rate adjustments in the coming years. So this would be the first of or one in a series of rate adjustments needed. A few places compared rate adjustments with other services. The dashboard that we have in some of our states will include things like the cable bill on there, so it would compare a typical water bill to a typical cable bill. In other parts of the country, we put SEC football tickets on there as a good measure to compare to. And of course, generally speaking, water is coming out less across the board on that. But that was something that was not often talked about. Initiatives that improve efficiency, so this could be water efficiency, water loss elimination, energy efficiency, anything that is basically trying to save money for the water system, that was occasionally communicated to the governing board. And then finally, customer satisfaction surveys. So these are the things that we said, we asked the staff level, what is important to you? And they've given us this list. We then went to the governing boards of these same systems and asked them the same question, and this is what we found. The things that the governing boards found to be interesting did not necessarily overlap with what the staff level people thought would be appropriate. So certainly the question of how much the average bill would change, the anticipated capital expenses, and the financial condition of the water utility did overlap pretty nicely between them, as well as bond covenants and comparisons of rates with other utilities. Comparison of rates was a little bit lower. But interestingly, the customer satisfaction surveys was something that governing boards felt was very helpful for them as they made decisions about changing or setting potential rates. And that was something that was not really identified at the staff level as being very important. And then there are certainly some items up here, the rate adjustments in the next few years and the efficiency improvements and things like that, and changing circumstances affecting financing, is that staff generally felt was pretty, many utilities that we interviewed conveyed this information, but generally speaking, their governing boards did not find it to be very helpful. And I think one of the big takeaways here is that it'll be really important to have this communication, not just frequently between staff and boards, but also in such a way that boards can be clearer with staff about what information they really need to be able to make decisions and to be able to address the concerns of customers. And so really that brings us to the, the final area that we wanted to look at, which is the involvement of our citizen customers in the process of setting rates. And so, what we were able to find is that the more the public participated in the rate decision, the more likely it was that the rate request would be approved. So, that being said, communities that said the public is not involved at all, 90% of them reported to us that the rate request was approved, but that number goes up, to 91, to 93, and then finally to 96. As the public is getting more and more involved in the process. And for those of you who are into statistical analyses, this was a statistically significant finding. So, this is something that we saw that even that difference between 90 and 96% really dovetailed with where the public is involved. And again, this is a correlation. It's not necessarily a causation that having the public is more involved. Perhaps communities that are more open to public meetings are more likely to approve rate increases. So it's a correlation, but it was an interesting finding nonetheless. And as I've presented this information in other contexts, I've had water systems say to me, well, sometimes I feel like we're doing a good job if we don't get people showing up to the public meetings and to the board meetings, because the only reason they come is when something goes wrong. So, this is hopefully a case where, these water systems are fostering a better dialogue with their customers about the level of service that they're interested in and how the service is playing out currently. And then again, we asked a little bit more detail of how the public was involved. The previous slide showed the likelihood of you getting the rate increase. But generally speaking, I think about 10% of our participants said the public was not involved at all. And the highest percentage by far at 56% was minimally involved. So meeting notes were posted on a website, open invitation to public meetings, and then it went up a little bit from there, active outreach, and then had citizens participate in public meetings. Obviously here, if you count up the numbers, they add up to more than 100, so people are able to pick more than one category here in terms of how the public is involved. But I think we see that, generally speaking, the higher the level of involvement, the more palatable the rate increases are. I often ask questions when I have an audience in front of me at a workshop or a conference. How many of you have ever gotten a call from one of your customers complaining about their bill? Almost every hand in the room goes up. That's a universal reaction. But when I ask the question, well, how many of your citizens who, if you're from a local government system, are also really the owners of the system, ever call to complain that you're not spending enough on capital? And in all the years that I've been doing this kind of work with the Environmental Finance Center, I've only had one system respond that they had that happen, and it was because they had a contract engineer who lived in the community, and he wanted them to hire him to actually do the work of fixing the water system. So typically, our average citizen is not going to necessarily be contacting us with this information, and so we have a responsibility to give them more of an opportunity to be involved in the process. So our bottom line today, and we'll be wrapping up in just a minute here to take your questions, is water systems are getting rate approvals, and that's good to see. Again, that 90% are getting the rate approval, but effective and frequent communication about salient issues along with public involvement can really make a difference in getting the rates that are approved up to the level that they need to be to cover capital costs. So it's not just a matter of getting the rates approved at all, but really that we need them, or we want them approved to really cover the largest percentage of the cost possible, to see that really strong operating ratio, including depreciation, as a key financial indicator. And so with that, we're going to wrap up, and happy to take your questions. I've got a couple of more quick polling questions for you before we turn over to your questions. And the first is dealing with the blog that I mentioned earlier. So our Environmental Finance Center here at University of North Carolina operates a blog, and as we start the next round of our project with EPA, they'll be on our EFC network page as well. And so if you would like to subscribe to the blog, just please click yes here, and we will add your email address to that. We send out posts about once a week on average. They're anywhere from 500 to 1,000 words on important environmental finance topics. We write very frequently on water, especially for small water systems. And I think it would be a really great resource for you to see some of the work we're doing and see some important information. So we'll go ahead and take your answers for that for just a second more. All right. And then our last question, as I mentioned earlier to you, we have the ability of providing in-depth one-on-one assistance for small water systems. So again, if you are a water system on the line today that serves 10,000 or fewer people, and you would like some help on communicating between the staff and the board, or on another area of rate setting, on asset management or water loss or energy management, any of the subjects that we cover, please click yes here, and we'll be in touch with you to set up a consultation. If you want some more information, if you're not sure this is something that would be helpful for you, you can go ahead and check that last box for us as well. And we'll be happy to get back in touch with you and give you a little bit more information. I will say, for those of you who are not from water systems on the line today, whether you are from our state primacy agencies, from EPA, or from the consulting community, we'd really love for you to be aware that we have this technical assistance available. It's up to 20 hours of our time, and it's free of charge to the systems that receive it. It's part of our grant. It'll just take some time on the system's end to provide us with the documentation we need to be able to help them. But be aware that we have this, and you can submit a request through our efcnetwork.org website as well. And so if you're working with a community that would benefit from this finance and managerial assistance, please let us know. And this will be continuing into 2016 under our next round of funding from EPA. So at that point, I will be happy to take the questions that you have. We have about 10 minutes left to go before we wrap up. And so you can use the the box there to submit your questions, and we'll be happy to get through as many of them as we can get through. Laura, do we have any questions coming in?
Yes, we do, Glenn. Would you like me to read them out loud to you, or would you like to look through them in? Okay, sure. So the first question we have is from As an Industry, what do you think we could do to stop people from buying bottled water when they have access to tap water? Bottled water, $346 per year. Tap water, 48 cents. Any questions?
Oh, wow. If I knew the answer to that, I could probably retire. But, you know, I think it's a good question, and I'm glad that it came up in this discussion because, you know, certainly for any of you who, you know, I have to travel as part of my job here, and sometimes at conferences you're in hotels, and, you know, the hotel has a bottle of water that, you know, is like $6 for this little bottle of water. I mean, clearly people are willing to pay for bottled water in a, you know, in a way that they're maybe not willing to pay for tap water. And again, I think we do have to remember that they have a marketing apparatus behind them that we certainly don't have. But I think, you know, I think some of the things that we could do is to really, again, focus on that idea of stressing about what's good about our water system. You know, if we have a good quality product that tastes good and that's safe to drink, that's something that we want to be putting out there in flyers. You know, for those of you who are from smaller communities, I used to, before I got involved in doing environmental finance work and environmental work generally, I actually used to work right for a small town newspaper for a few years. And, you know, I think most small town papers are happy to receive anything to print that is, you know, that is interesting for their readership. And so I think that that's something that we could take advantage of more, is really getting out there and being very positive about the product that we have, and not just that it's meeting those minimum safety requirements, but that it's also thinking about taste and odor and color and pressure and things like that as well. But it's an uphill battle. You know, certainly I think that price differential is something that we might want to be stressing as well.
Okay, so the next question I think is off of the report card from ASCE. It's, if we are a D+, what is the score for the rest
of Sorry, can you repeat that, Laura? You cut out a little bit.
Yes, so if we are a D+, what is the score for the rest of the world?
Oh, well, that's a really interesting question. I don't know the answer to that, although, you know, there are some studies that are out there that we've been looking at water infrastructure condition. I mean, one of the issues that we have, and keep in mind that that D+ is for all infrastructure across the board, and certainly I think we know a lot of countries where it's going to be much worse than that. Again, maybe the D+ is a little bit overstated. But one of the biggest issues that I think we have in the United States is that we were one of the first countries to develop a lot of types of infrastructure that American Society for Civil Engineers reviews. And because of that, you know, our infrastructure is older than certainly some other countries that we've seen who have grown more economically in the last 20 or 30 years. And, you know, I'm fortunate enough to be able to travel abroad a good bit, not for work, but just for pleasure. And you know, there are a lot of parts of the country where, you know, the infrastructure is comparable or better to what we have in some parts of the U.S., unfortunately. And so, you know, it's certainly an interesting issue, one that doesn't often come up in political campaigns. You know, we have a presidential race going on right now. I don't know. I haven't been watching all the debates, but I'm not sure there's been a lot of questions about infrastructure funding. Some of you may be aware of John Oliver, a comedian who has a show on HBO. You know, kind of looking at the news. He actually did a 20-minute segment on infrastructure in the U.S., which is unusual for it to get that much airtime. But, you know, I don't have a good answer for that as what the rest of the world would be. But, you know, I do think that generally speaking, the age of all of our infrastructure, especially our water and wastewater lines, is really one of the big handicaps that we have.
All right, so the next question has to do with the survey. What was the average size of the communities surveyed and responded? How many of these that responded were below 10,000?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I apologize because I don't have that information right in front of me. It was a good mix of sizes of communities. We certainly had some larger, above 10,000 communities there, but many across the country were smaller. I apologize, I don't have the number in front of me, but I'll be happy to send it to you offline.
Okay, and Glenn, you might not have these numbers in front of you as well. A second question about the survey, what is the median household income of those surveyed looked at and compared to the state average MHI?
You know, and again, I don't have the report right in front of me, but my recollection is that the MHIs of the communities that we ended up surveying and took part in the polling that we did were fairly comparable to the typical state MHI communities. But certainly, I think as we all know, there are just, big discrepancies in the income of communities that can impact this. You know, I've worked in communities, small towns here in North Carolina and around the country that, their median household income is, $10,000 to $15,000 below the state average. They have 30, 40, 50% of their residents living below the poverty line. Their operating ratio is below 1, and their rates are already high. And, it's a major problem that we have in affording some of this infrastructure, especially as the availability of grant funding at the federal level has been dwindling over time. So again, I apologize, I don't have the exact numbers in front of me, but I feel like we had a pretty representative sample.
Okay, great. And I think we have time for one more question. So this person is saying, I think the annual increase of costs of service for utilities outpaced average inflation rate. As such, have you asked in the survey what the % rate increase was historically? If yes, what is the average annual rate increase percentage? Thanks.
Yeah, so that's another great question. It's not something that we asked in the survey, but I think you're absolutely right that oftentimes we're seeing that the rate increases are outpacing inflation. Although, again, on the flip side, we've also, I've met many a community in my years of doing this work that haven't had a rate increase in 10 to 20 years and clearly are falling far behind that. We do some other rate analysis work in states where we do statewide surveys, and we may have that particular piece of information. Again, it was not something we did in our survey, but I will dig around and see if we can find that, and if so, I'll be happy to share it with the group and with everybody.
Okay, great. And so, Glenn, we have a couple other questions. Would you be willing, just so these, people get their questions answered, to take a look at them and maybe reach out to them if you have any answers to what they're asking about?
Yeah, absolutely. I apologize if we weren't able to get to your question today, but I'll be happy to answer it offline, send you an email, and if you have any follow-up, just please email me directly. My email address and phone number are right up on the screen now. And they'll be in the copy when we send you out the announcement for the webinar. We'll include the link to the presentation. They'll go up on our website. And I do want to mention that you'll also get a chance to answer an evaluation survey for today's webinar. And we really encourage you to do that as well. So it's just being posted in the chat box right now. If you have a minute to do it now, that would be great for us. And then also you'll receive it by email as well. But we really appreciate you taking a minute and letting us know what you thought of our program today and our programs in general. And again, just want to remind you of our Asset Management Ask the Expert webinar. It's going to be really terrific. Our colleague Heather Himmelberger will be here on Thursday to talk about asset management, and she has a partner named Ross Waugh who lives in New Zealand, where they do quite a bit of asset management work very successfully. He's actually going to be joining live on the line from New Zealand, and so they'll be there to answer any questions you have about asset management, and that's Thursday, and we encourage you to sign up for that if you have not already. And then starting again in January, we'll have another series of webinars for the upcoming calendar year. All right, Laura, I think that's it on my end.
Great. All right, thank you everyone for joining us.